talking about Ryuk, stopping Ryuk ransomware by shutting down Bazar. A little bit of background. When Matt hit me up a few weeks ago, he asked me, do you have anything interesting to talk about? And I was like, I mean, I pretty much probably every day have interesting things to talk about. Nothing really super specific. And then something occurred, and I was like, bam, I can talk about that. However, a few days later, CISA from government agency from underneath DHS came out with this advisory about Bazar Loader and Ryuk targeting hospitals. And then the next day, team was like, hey, we should write a blog post and kind of share a whole bunch of information based on previous incidences and information we have on what we've been tracking as Bazar and Ryuk. And so about 10 of us wrote this blog in about less than a day and then had it published. And so then as I came back to it, I'm like, well, I really don't know what to talk about, as we kind of already capped this. So kind of making this in a hybrid talk of a warning story, and a warning as a whole. So who am I? I'm Paul. I work at Red Canary as an incident handler. A little about me, handler of cyber shenanigans, as I put it. Also the curator of the finest artisanal malware. I have a Russian adversary that lives in my house. He's known as C2. He doesn't speak a lick of English. He's very furry. It's my cat. His name's Kelvin II. When we adopted him, he was given that name. He already had that name, so we nicknamed him C2. And if you want to come creep on my Twitter and send me random things, it's burning_PM. Feel free to tag along for the journey on Twitter. So a little bit of background on Ryuk and Bazar Loader. Full disclosure, I am not an Intel analyst, so there are definitely people within our team and other people around the globe that are probably better than me, but so at least giving lay of the land some high level information as we're going into it. So Bazar backdoor, really the initial access point, right? When we're talking about how this is going to get onto the box and how it's going to lead to Ryuk. It's a loader and a backdoor, basically. It collects information about the affected machines, deploys additional malware, so it acts as a dropper as well. Bazar actually has some interesting ties to the creator of TrickBot, which is another notorious Trojan. And surprisingly, TrickBot was actually, not surprisingly, but TrickBot was actually a precursor to Ryuk infections. So kind of back in last year or so, Emotet was the initial payload that would get executed on the machine, which would then lead to TrickBot, which then would lead to Ryuk. So it's kind of like the three horsemen, if you will. So Ryuk itself, so again, a separate family, separate malware. So it's known as Wizard Spider, UNC, 1878, Team 9, and probably about 7 other names that are associated with it due to multiple organizations tracking it and what they've named it. It's been around and tracked for many years. So Ryuk is not a new thing. Kind of had a lull period, a small time where it wasn't as active or relevant, but now it's coming back and a lot more aggressive. They're big game hunters, so they're basically targeting large organizations. It doesn't matter, they're not targeting specific verticals necessarily, but you are seeing more and more things against hospitals, K through 12 education. If you look in the news for anything Ryuk, you can basically find a pattern of the verticals it's going after. So understanding how the patterns of it and what the timeline looks like. So when we're talking infection of malware, right? User receives an email, right? They get a link or a malicious document, they open it, they execute it, and then bam, there's your initial access. From there, we can see on a timeline. This was a timeline that the team at Red Canary put together of understanding, like, in the instances we've seen, like, what does it look like and how does it go? And there's 2 reports that we'll be kind of taking a look at as part of this, which is from the DFIR report, as well as some information from Red Canary selfishly, and seeing like how fast this is executing, right? And we're gonna also look at, we can kind of see here what they're doing, right? So if we think of TTPs, how are they achieving their objectives, right? If you think of Red Team, right? You do different things to either get DA, achieve your objectives of trying to find file shares with juicy information. There's different ways you go about it. Malware is exactly the same way. So if you're looking for new tactics and techniques to add to your repertoire, look at what successful malware is doing, right? Look at Bazar Loader. Things like process hollowing, enumerating domains with lulbins, NL Trust, or things like AD find. And then all of a sudden you get things dropped like Cobalt Strike. using WMI and PowerShell and run DLL32, right? These are all things that you've probably all heard of, and now we can look at how the malware is actually doing it and kind of replicate that as a red team, but also understanding the importance of it as a blue team. So if we look at the execution, right, we already named off a bunch of things they're doing. So once it executes, we have limited time. And what we're going to do is we're going to pivot into a couple reports and kind of see, like, there's instances of Ryuk going from user opening a document to ransomware in 2 hours. There's also instances of the exact same thing in 5 hours and within organizations. So when we talk about how this targeted like healthcare or hospitals and other organizations, like, it's very impactful. So we need to act quickly. And if you look at this list of what they leveraged in some of the reports and different things that we've seen, it's not crazy custom malware, right? Run DLL, AD Find, PowerShell, NLTest, CMD, Net, WMI. The only really things that come onto the box are things like Cobalt Strike, Rubus, and AD Find. AD Find is not a lull bin or a System 32. All the other ones, they're built in, so they're leveraging them to achieve their objectives. So let's pivot real quick. So we're going to jump in. So this is the blog post that the Red Canary team built out to kind of walk through the different things that we've seen and how we can detect it. So from a red team perspective, again, if you're thinking, well, how can I change it up, or what is successful and how can I do it? Well, look at what successful malware is doing and then add that to your repertoire. But also from the blue team, like, what are they doing and how can we prevent it or detect it? So if we kind of just step through, there's a timeline again. First one being process hollowing. So leveraging like command prompt to process hollow and then continue execution. Things like when we talk about thinking of ransomware as a whole, right? The objective is to go from standard user to domain admin to deploy out the malware. So I need to do AD recon. I need to start elevating permissions and moving laterally. So using things like NLTest and AD Find to find information about the domain itself. And also using built-in tools like NetGroup. So identify the domain admins or the enterprise admins so that I can continue going forward. Then once Bazar meets its objectives, the next thing is to then, well, it's time for Ryuk. I've done my part, so now we're going to pass it off, right? We're going to then drop a DLL, which is going to be a Cobalt Strike beacon. We're going to leverage DLL, run DLL32 to, or excuse me, run DLL to execute, and then continue forward. But again, we can see things like standard malware, but also things like different beacons, whether you're talking Empire, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, Mythic, all the, you know, Cobber, pick your plethora of C2 frameworks, and you know, the ideas are the same behind them, right? And then going down through. So if we look at the DFIR report, these are great reports in understanding the impact and how quickly these are moving. And again, detailing the things from other organizations and what we're seeing to basically just give out the information, because it is massively impacting, right? When you think of ransomware back a few years ago, it was potentially an actor was in the environment for something like 30 days, and then it would get ransomed off. Now you're talking about 2 hours from 0 to 100. That is quick, that's impactful, and it's devastating, especially when you're thinking of Bazar and Ryuk targeting healthcare, especially in the middle of the pandemic, right? Taking down critical infrastructure to assist people. So if we look at this particular speed run for Ryuk in 2 hours, so Bazar gets executed. So a user gets sent an email, in this case, potentially something like a Google Drive link, right? They download the file, they open it up, some code executes. Then you're talking, okay, so now I have an initial beacon on there. I start to do some activity, and then all of a sudden I start to do my recon, I collect some information, and then next, Cobalt Strike. Then I start to do additional tools like bringing in things like AD Find and Rubus to help expedite and gather more information and start to pivot throughout. Then I do something like was in the chat earlier, zero logon, unfortunately. Now I got to escalate to domain admin, right? When I'm thinking about my efficiency as an attacker trying to get from 0 to 100, how quick can I do it? So using the things that are whether within the environment or I have to bring the tools in to achieve those objectives. Then I start doing things like lateral movement using RDP. Once I have credentials and I can start pivoting, right? Why use things like PS exec when I can just RDP and fly under the radar, or, you know, just log in and use a GUI. Then as we keep going, we start to, again, continue lateral movement. And then once I finally got to where I need to be, I actually exfil some data as part of my ransoming, not necessarily part of the toolkit. You're seeing that they exfil data out of the environment, and then they'll hold on to that, and they'll ransom off the environment, and they'll say, well, either pay us or we're going to release this data, right? So now from a hospital perspective, you're thinking, well, HIPAA information, patient information, potentially accounting data, right? Saying, well, if you're not going to pay, well, we're just going to release the data. From a threat actor standpoint, right, in order to keep themselves in business, they're probably going to want to, if they receive payment, either not release it, because then what's preventing the next person from paying them, right? If they're just going to release it even after they got payment, there's no point in a business potentially trying to pay them 50, 100,000, if not more, than just shutting everything down and rebuilding it since the data's already gone. So now we have some background of what they're trying to do. Let's pivot back in. So we're thinking of an IR, right? So now all of a sudden hospital's gotten hit, we need to jump in and we need to start acting. We need to start shutting this down, containing it. But there's things we have to remember. First, adversaries don't have rules. There's nothing stopping them from saying, oh, well, I can't do this. This is my scope of engagement, right? None of that applies. Next, nothing's off limits, right? Everything's fair game to them. However, we have policies, procedures, things that we may have to abide by. But in the case of something like a hospital, in my opinion, those don't matter. If they're not playing by rules, I'm not going to follow the playbooks. So in that case, we sometimes have to throw the book out the window. Right, maybe we have the perfect IR plans, we have all these documented processes and procedures. However, sometimes we got to completely go off script and go off book in order to contain and eradicate the threat. Speed is everything. When we're talking about 2 hours to an entire environment, whether it's 100 endpoints or 100,000 endpoints, speed is crucial. It's teamwork or get out. Everybody at that point is all hands on deck. And one of the things that's great about the Red Canary team is it's not just one person going, oh, we're going to do this, right? It's a team of detection engineers. It's a team of incident handlers, intelligence, threat research, right? And then also the team from customer perspectives of, you're talking network ops, sysadmins, web application owners, executive leadership, right? Everybody coming together to make this work. It's not just a single person doing it. And lastly, we need to identify the threat, we need to contain it, eradicate it, and recover. So now, we're talking about shutting it down. So you're talking 0 to 100, 2 hours or less, potentially 5 hours, sometimes a little bit longer, so you have a little leeway. But the faster we can contain it and shut it down, the better we are. So before it even gets to Cobalt Strike, right, you're thinking your second beacon, Cobalt Strike, if we can shut down Bazar, the first infection, we can prevent the ransomware. So how do we do it? Well, again, we need to isolate and contain. So when we first initially see the activity, we need to step on it. So it's get it isolated, get it contained. How do you do that? Well, things like your EDR and your endpoint prevention tools. It could be even network access. So even if you don't have EDR, use the network, right? Shut the port off of the switch or the firewall. Or worst case scenario, just go unplug it and turn it off. Next, we need to talk about blocking, right? So if it's something that cannot come down, or in order to prevent it from, let's say we do contain it, but we're thinking about lateral movement now, and they're using the same binary to pivot throughout, right? If we think about PowerShell, WMI, NL test, AD find, right? We need to contain them. So we need to start blocking our atomic indicators. What are the C2? So these are things like IPs, domains, hashes of the known malicious binaries, but also the tools that they're using. So in this case, we shut down and we blocked run DLL. We blocked and banned NL test, AD find, regserve 32, PowerShell, right? So now you're thinking, okay, I am preventing core Windows binaries from executing the environment. That's going to break legitimate tools. You're absolutely correct, it will. However, when you're thinking about the impact, if I don't do this, or the potential risk that if I don't do these things, right, I'd rather take a few systems down or a few applications from running than potentially letting an entire environment get completely obliterated by some malware, and etc. Right? So find the tools that they're leveraging, the tactics and the techniques of how they're doing it, and let's block them. Hypervisors and guests. If you're, in the case where we've noticed that hypervisors are hosting these systems and those are impacted, right? Shut down the guests, shut down the hypervisors. Power them off. So now we've isolated, right? So we've done all this work. We isolated these endpoints. We calls and the switches. We banned the atomic indicators, IPs, domains, and hashes, all the tools. So now we potentially have shut down partially an entire environment or a section of this environment. Well, now we need to validate the work that we've done. Are we still seeing the continued activity? Right? So then we can identify, have we contained it? Have we truly actually contained it? Or do we still need work to do, right? What else can we do? What else should we be doing? Once we've validated and we've hunted the indicators that we know so far, and we're not seeing any current activity, then we can start to recover. This is bringing systems back online. So even if we shut down systems that were not impacted, we can slowly start to bring them up, right? We got to resume operations, especially thinking about a hospital. This is what we need to do. So we need to bring the systems back online. We need to start restoring access. So that could be like we started disabling user accounts. We started resetting passwords. So these are things that we need to do in order to resume operations. Then we need to reset, right? There's going to be systems that, you know what? It's easier for me to burn down a VM and then spin up a new one than it would be to try and go through and remediate everything, right? Deleting the persistence, the registry modifications, the files, all that kind of stuff. In some cases, we'll do those if that system, in the case of like an XP box, can't just be rebuilt. We'll do those manual remediations, but sometimes it's faster just to burn it down and rebuild it. And yeah, that's kind of it. So again, it's kind of a warning that we're seeing of these different, not just Bazar or Rants or Ryuk, but a lot of malware families. Recently, Zloader is another Trojan that's kind of like Bazar, that initial access that's leading to ransomware. So it's not just one thing. You're seeing these commodity malware now leading to destructive malware, right? Like ransomware. So when we start thinking of these things, and from a red team perspective, like it's important to understand like the tactics that they're using, why are they successful? Because, right, they're making money, they're operationalizing it, but from red team, like we can adopt those. From a blue team, we need to look at not what red team's doing, but also what malware is doing and how can we gain visibility into it, but how can we also detect it? How can we prevent it? So that way we're mitigating the threats and the risks associated with it. So like I said, I kind of created this like hybrid talk. What is it? And also kind of the story, but it's important to understand like there's a lot that we can do. And sometimes you kind of have to go again, completely off script and just nuke it and do whatever's right in order to mitigate the threat and the risk at the time to make sure that you're still operationalizing without shutting down an entire hospital in the middle of a pandemic, unfortunately, but that is it. And last thing, like I said, in order to stop this threat that we witnessed, it took a whole team. So incident handling team, intel, detection engineering, threat research, also information from like the DEFA report kind of helped to build out some of this, but also some of the research that we've done, as well as other organizations. But then basically, like I said, when this came out about a week or so ago, right before Halloween, a lot of organizations, researchers, individuals devoted a bunch of time to dumping information publicly to help other organizations and businesses understand the tactics, techniques, atomic indicators, leverage so that they can prevent these threats. So it just goes to show that sometimes we can come together as an organization, a community to prevent these types of things and limit the threat, especially in a situation where things like hospitals or schools are being targeted at an alarming rate.